Hi everyone, I'm Miss Gian, and today we're diving into chapter 7, which is all about utility. Okay, so when you hear the word utility, you think of the word usefulness, and you're about right when you think of utility about in psychometrics, same po siyang definition about siya usefulness, but it's more than just usefulness. It has a very specific meaning pertaining to three big constructs. In sum, a test is useful if there's psychometric soundness. It's and the benefits outweigh the cost. Mao gyud na in sum ang atong turyaan, but we'll dive deep about what those three means. But for now, let me introduce you to the learning objectives for this session. So hopefully by the end of this session, you'll be able to identify utility in the context of psychological testing, also identify and explain the factors that affect the test utility and distinguish unsa ang economic or non-economic costs and benefits of testing. And number four is you'll be able to explain the purpose and methods of utility analysis. And five, finally, you'll be hopefully be able to learn the main methods that people use to set those cut scores. Sige, so sugod na ta. Ready na mo? Wala mo choice. Dapat ma-ready na mo. So, unsa na siyang utility? Put simply, it's the practical value of using a test. Okay? The practical value. So, unsay practical value if I use a test in helping me come up with a decision? So, the utility here asks the question, is this test actually useful in the real world? Now, notice that I highlighted the word practical value. Okay? This is key when we're talking about utility because a test can have the best or the most psychometric soundness variable possible, meaning taas kay siyang reliability, taas kay siyang validity. But then, it is not worth the time, it is not worth the money, and also very hassle kay siya gamiton. And when that happens, if it has very high psychometric soundness, but it's not very beneficial, then that's not really useful. So, or those are the things that we will talk about when we're discussing utility. So, particularly, we have here the following questions. We have here, is this test cost effective? How does it compare to other already existing tests? Kay, if the previous or older ones are better in comparison to your newly developed ones, why gamit imuhang bagong test, di ba? And etc. Mo ni siyang mga questions na kasagarang gamiton when we're talking about utility. So in short then, in layman's term, utility is or there is utility if ang benefit sa testing outweigh its cost. So again, in other words, it will be more costly than not to administer a test in the long run. Sometimes magud ang effect ana in the long run pa than to spend just a few like peso in purchasing that test and use it to help you make good decisions, make good decisions, especially on very critical na mga, kung ano, mga scenarios. For example, when you're hiring a pilot, di ba? You want someone that's really good. Otherwise, it will cost you billions and billions and billions of lost in kanang kuan, in not only clients or customers' trust, but also in money. So, kani siyang utility. It is not just about test pod. It can be for training programs. What's the use for putting that in place? It's also for mga interventions, clinical interventions. So again, I want to put it in your head now when we're talking about utility, we're talking about the benefit of a certain program, intervention, or test batteries. When we're applying it, how does it weigh in if we don't use it? Unsa man mas grabe ba tag cost or mas dagan tag benefit when we use or not use a test? So ato ta sa first discussion question para makutaw sa beginning inyong utok. So think of a situation where you had to make a decision based on some kind of test or assessment. How did you judge whether that assessment was useful? So for your end, for people here that are full student, did not work yet, this might be too abstract for you all. But later on, when you enter the workforce, you will understand the gravity and the practicality of this question. When you have an assessment or test, how did you judge whether it was useful? So, example, did most of you already? I think most of you took the medical test already. Do you think that was useful or was it a waste of your time? How did you come up with those kind of judgments? So, those are my kuan. And also we have like the scales, right, that I let you answer in psychometrics. Do you think those tests that I let you answer is useful, or is it just a waste of your time? So I want you to think of that. Ponder on your answer, and hopefully you'll be able to kanang putaw your utok with that kind of kanang with this kind of question. So there are three factors that we need to consider when we're talking about a test's utility. So first, we have the psychometric soundness. Some of the things here very familiar na mo because it's what we intensively discussed a few kanang chapters back, no. Mo po na yung mga nakapagkunot sa inyong mga noun. Okay. So hopefully you have a good familiarity already with these words. Pero again, it also includes the cost and the benefits. So we also look at the cost. What are the ratio of the cost over the benefit? So mas dagan ba tag makuha na cost if we use the test compared to when we don't use a test? Because if that's the case, it's probably better to just forgo with the testing procedure or to forgo with the clinical intervention or the program. So igana siya in a nutshell. So we'll do a deep dive on the next few slides about aning mga individual factors. So first, let's start with psychometric soundness. So reliability, how a test consistently produce a score. So how consistently a test measure what it measures. Keyword is consistently. And then validity, does it really claim to measure what it measures? For lack of a better word, and para lang naalang siya short-term kuan, it refers to the accuracy, no, of your kanang test. And then utility is what is the practical value of the information derived from the test scores. Now we know that validity should happen first for us to see na ng karang sa gani reliable ang test. But also, validity should be established first for us to consider that a test is useful. Because of course, that's logic. It will tell you, di ba, na example, you wanna see how high your depression scores are, right? And if that test is not valid, meaning ang iya ding gikuha is not your depression score but your mood, then wala di siya make sense because supposed to be it's a clinical diagnosis for the psychologist to understand or to know usa imong depression score, but then it did not capture man the depression score, it captured something else, so the test is not valid, therefore the test is not useful. Pero this is the case. What if it is valid? Indeed, nakakuha ka sa imong depression score. But the way that you administer it, lisod kay siya, dagan siya chichi-burichi, no? So, dili makasabot ang clinician sa pag-administer sa test. Siya, unsa man pang Mars, mani na mga examples. Wala ko kasabot sa instructions. Mahal kaayo siya, it costs 1 million pesos ang usa ka test protocol. So then, even if it's valid, diba? Even if it's valid, yes, na siya 99% accuracy. Iya yung matag, imong depression score, matagan po niya imuhang future. Iya, naka-valid ang test. So, pero mahal man kay siya, dagan kay siya cost, di siya masabtan, di siya sayon gamiton. So even if it's valid, it is not useful. So let me give a kanang conclusion out of that. No, a test must be valid to be useful, but a valid test is not necessarily useful. Kay dagang factors mo come into play beyond validity, which affect a test utility. So here's another example. It's in the naani siya sa book. So, ang researchers, naka-develop sila sweat patch para makadetect og cocaine. If supposed to be, di ba, mangihi man ka. So, kani sila naka-develop sila new device or new product na i-stick lang nimo sa imong arm and then makadetect na dayon siya. And the tool is good. It has 92% agreement with the urine test. So, meaning to say, gitan-aw siya no kung kaning test gi-compare ang iyahang kanang score sa kanang sweat patch, and then 92% ang iyahang agreement. So it's very reliable. It's also very high in validity. Pero nganong low man siya og utility ngano man kay ang sweat patch pwede prone man siya to participants manipulation, meaning pwede siya tanggalon, pwede siya kanang pwede siya i-tamper with. So dili ka, even if naa siya 92% validity, the way it is used is prone to collecting data that is erroneous. So, mo na siyang, a test could be valid, pero di siya necessarily useful. Sige, so we're done with psychometric soundness, which is the first factor. Let's go over the second factor, which is the cost of testing. Okay, so, ang kaning cost, when we're thinking about cost, we usually associate with money. Yes, money is involved, but it's more than just money when we're talking about the cost of testing. So, what am I pertaining to? We have the obvious cost, right? Unsay mga obvious costs? We need to buy for the test protocols. We need to purchase the test protocols, the test manual. We need to pay the psychometrician or employee nato no na psychologist or psychometrician. We also need to rent out probably mga facilities for us to conduct testing para ma-standardize ang administration sa test. So naatay mga obvious na cost of testing. And this is what we call the economic cost. When you're thinking of cost with regards to money, you're thinking about the economic cost. Unsa day ni siyang non-economic cost. This is the cost that, well, doesn't involve money. So, example, ani, mga hidden cost ni siya. Dili siya kana bitaw. At the start, it won't be obvious, but you will feel it. And gradual ang imuhang kanang pagka lugi. So, gradual yung pagkalugi na murag ma-shock na lang ka na, hala, 1 billion na dayang nawagtang sa imuhang kanang company or ang harm sa because of not testing, di ba? So, ingana na siya. So, mo na siyang you need to compare the cost. So, what do we mean by the non-economic cost? Okay, so example, if you don't do screening very well, panalitan, if we have people with disorders that are that would make them harm themselves and or harm other people, and then you did not use a good screening tool to keep them, to involuntarily put them in a facility, so you're harming the public with not using a test. Or example here kaning airline, right, na naa siya ana siya ba na uy kaning attention to detail test mahal ba ni nga 2,000 per test man ni siya pila gud atong applicant in a year. So let's cost cut niya na ang niya na ang finance i-cost cut na HR tanggalan na siya na test kay tanan bitaw mga apply gikan bitaw India na so makakuan na tanan gikan bitaw na sila kanang pilot school whatever what you call it, diba? So wala sila na tanggalan na kay gikan bitaw na sa school kapasar sila, so wala na, we expect them to be very cautious. What happens when people hear of this decision? Wala ninyo gitas inyong mga pilots? Ay dili ta dira sa Cebu, di ta mag-mention og dito dira sa kuan oy yellow airplane kay makakuan na siya. I did not say na wala sila nagtesting, it's just an example. Dili ta dira oy kay kanang wala mo din na nila gi proper screen ang kuan makuyawan ta ani basig kanang hello love goodbye love ta ani ron nya, di ba? So nga nanon loss of public confidence. What happens when people do not trust you anymore? So of course if you're running a business, no, your profits will go down if people won't trust your product, if people won't trust your services. So another is kanang aside sa harm sa society, no, and also like loss of profit pero gradual lang siya na mubo lang kalit wag tang na din kag 200 billion loss of profit because of hiring a tanga na employee. So kanang you also have a ethical concern because if you do not administer a proper test for you to get the person that's right for the job, that's very unethical. Okay? So panalitan na bangko na nakaana sila naman na test na gitawag na kalimot ko sa test pero it measures how honest you are ba or how less likely you are to do something, less likely ka mangawat. And I test and I forgot the name. I'll if I remember the test. Usually i-apply na siya sa mga cashiers, no, sa i-administer na siya sa mga cashiers or people that handles money. Now if this bank no, the bank of Century Tuna. Kana na lang kay nagtanaw ko sa ako ang Century Tuna. Okay, so the Bank of Century Tuna. Nya, ana sila na. Aguy, kamahal ba ani na test? Uy, na expect na lang tabi na kanang mga let's trust our applicants. No, we know they're very good, very honest people. Di na taaning mga ingani na test uy kay kanang mahal ka ayo nya. Kibawgod ta na mga ma-apply kay well intention. O ni ana si manager. So good po si HR, sige cost cutting ta kay total mahal kay siya na test. Unya, naka-hire day tug ka ng kawatan. Niya, overnight, nakawat tanan ilahang money. So, nga na siya ang non-economic cost sa testing. So, at the sugod, no, at face view, at the forefront, it might look like you are saving money. In the long run, you are losing a huge sum. And this is the kind of thinking that I want you to have when you're talking about the cost benefit with regards to testing. Okay, so let's now proceed to the benefits of testing. So, unsa may gina-consider nato to say na the test is worth the investment. So, of course, we have the economic benefits, right? Productivity translates to a lot of sales. For example, if your salesperson is, by use of test, you were able to hire a really good salesperson. So, taas kay siya productivity, taas kay siya nabaligya na kanang Usana, taas kay siya nabaligya na Avon, di ba? So, what happens there, di ba? You your profit. Those are the obvious benefit still pertaining to monetary. You reduce training costs because that person is already very good already. You don't need to train them, to put them in a program, which is another cost, by the way. So, you reduce that. So, another, kung ano po no, another savings na po na siya. And in short, you good a good ROI with your test. Now, unsa di ay ang non-economic benefit? This pertains to, so unsa din ang mga non-economic benefits. So these are the benefit that you will get without consider, or like not considering money ba, like it's things that you cannot put a price tag on. So for example, if you're hiring students that really love psychology or really love the program, then we would have a good teacher student dynamics, no, kay dili na mapagos ang teacher og really engaging the student with the material, because initially from the start pa lang they're very interested with the course, no, and whatever happens, whatever comes na struggles, because they love the course, it's what they really want to do and not what their parents want them to do, then we will have a good work environment, happier workplace, happier students, and in the future, no, happier psychologists, psychometricians, HR, guidance, social worker. Diba? So those are the kind of things na dili gyud nimo maput o din mo ma-measure in terms of money, pero it's a huge benefit. And usually mo involved na pud siya kanang like the benefit to the society at large. So let's discuss now kung unsaon gid na pagkuha utility analysis. Di ba na ay economic kana cost and benefit of having a task or administering a certain intervention or program. So before we ask how we compute utility analysis, let's first kanang ask what is utility analysis. So utility analysis, as I mentioned, in its shortest, in its simplest form, in a nutshell, it is about a certain family of techniques. Daghan kaayo ni sila, no, na formula, for lack of a better word, no, daghan og technique, daghang formula, and each formula it would yield, or it would need to ask certain input, and those input would yield certain output. So unsa may input na akong gimin, panalitan, pangayuan ka og unsa may average salary aning mga employees, pila ka book ang number of applicants, unsa may mean standard scores nila. So unsa pud ang katutanan, i-multiply, i-minus nimo sa total number of applicants, nya i-times nimo sa kanang sita gani sa cost sa usa ka sa cost sa pag-administer og one test. Now, I'm talking about a very specific formula here, and we will uncover it later on. Surprise ako kung unsa ni siya na formula, no? Pero igana siya, that's just one of the many formula that we use in order to conduct utility analysis. So again, no, when we talk about utility analysis, we're talking about its practical value. Okay? So it is a family of cost-benefit techniques. So for tests, it helps us ask or understand or decide things like, asa may mas better na test to use? Is test A better than test B? Or unsa man, would it help if we add another test to our test battery? Would it improve anything? Or is it better if we just cost cut everything? We don't administer the test. Would we save more money with regards to that? Is our hiring process more efficient? Is our school placement process assessment more efficient without the test? So, mo na siya ang mga questions na i-try og answer sa utility analysis. The same po sa program, no? When we conduct utility analysis, it's not limited to just testing. In general, we're talking about the interventions. Could be clinical interventions, training programs is also one, no? So, it basically just asks the big word, is it worth it? In the end, ba ng cost in terms of time, money, effort, is it worth it if we use this tool, if we use this task, if we use this program, or if we use this intervention? So, na a real world example, which is kaning Casio and Ramos in 1986, wherein they found that a particular assessment approach for selecting mga managers could save the telephone company over 13 million in just 4 years. Of course, when they found this out, they're conducting utility analysis and they're using it with the aid of a statistics or a formula. Okay? So, ingani ni siya ang utility analysis. Iyan na siyang try to find out at the end of the day, is it worth the trouble? Travel. Is it worth the trouble, or do we get our ROI? So, ana siya, no? So, ana siyang utility analysis is an umbrella term for various methods with different inputs and outputs. I mentioned this one already. Na it's not just one formula, but there are a lot of methods, and these methods we'll be tackling just a few lang siguro. We'll not even do a very very sa tagani kanang detailed discussion on some. So just to make us familiar with a few methods of utility analysis. So with that being said, how do we conduct utility analysis? So there are two approaches. We have the expectancy data, which we already discussed, or which was found in chapter 6 towards the predictive validity na part, no. Naa dito ang Taylor Russell and Naylor Shine na mga kanang formula. And we have the second approach, which is the BCG formula. For me, this is easier to understand, also easier to calculate as compared to the other two. As compared to the expectancy data. So, in its simplest word, and a very simple way to understand expectancy data is when you take a test score. So, you have a test and you have a score out from the test, right? So, nanay test. And does the score in our test show us how we succeed in a certain criteria? Diba? I mentioned this one already, the predictive validity. So does this score predicts our success in a certain criteria? The criteria being whatever, right? Like your job performance, your high GPA, anything under the sun. Char. So, nga na siya, no? Mo na siya ang expectancy data. So, inig-compute ana, if ang ato ang test score, di ba? If the more taas atong test score, the more siya mo correlate, no? Or mo predict regression, the more siya mo predict og high criterion, right? Or X and our C, then we say that our test has utility. So we use the tools Taylor Russell na tables, Naylor Shine as well, na tables, which you have encountered in the previous chapter, but it has its own disadvantages and advantages. Just check on the book about this, no, ang mga disadvantages and advantages nila. There are disadvantages if you look at all three. Most of the three approaches, like the expectancy data, the Taylor Russell, and the Naylor Shine, they're very dichotomous sa ilahang expression sa utility. They cannot really analyze utility gains. So wala siya kanang in terms of wala siya consideration sa cost sa testing as compared to the BCG formula. So, hapit ko mayong BGC formula. So, BCG formula, si Brogden, Cronbach, Glesser formula, it talks about utility gains. So, mo lang yun na ang wala sa tulo, no? Aside from it's very dichotomous in its koana, like it divides data into successful and unsuccessful. It also cannot estimate the utility gains as compared to the BCG formula. So, unsa man ni pag-calculate ang BCG formula when you encounter this one later on sa board exam or in our test or exams, you just think that it's benefit minus the cost. The cost having two variables only. That is the number of applicant times the cost of testing per individual. Kani siya ayon na kung maglisod og memorize, just think of this one na mao ni siya ang pag-calculate sa utility gains. So unsay sulod sa letter B? Sorry, according to kanang Brogden, no, it's the number of applicants times the average tenure ana na position times the kanang criterion validity. Di ba remember when we get our validity, there is an R value, right? There is a reliability coefficient. So once we have that sa test, we put it in the formula. So mo na siya ang R, no? So next is ang SDY, usa nang SDY. Mo ni siya ang lisod kanang ibutangan man kay basically estimate man gid ni siya. Unlike bitaw sa kuan na adyo kay number, di ba na adyo kay average tenure, imong i-average ang isapol na kay 100 ka employees ano na position, imo na siyang i-average how long they will stay in that position. Na atay actual data for that. We also have actual data for N, right? Na atay pila man jud in a year atong applicants for this position. Sample call center, right? Naaman sa mga naka-HR na before, kami HR magko call center before, we really have this data. Pila ka buok ang hires namo, pila ka buok among applicants in a certain month, in a certain a quarter, and even in a year. No, we have annual reports. We have our R value as well. We can calculate that. Remember? So katong reliability coefficient. But this is the standard deviation of performance in dollars. How can you estimate that? How can you estimate how a performance would cost in dollars? Diba? So, ang mga researchers nga na sila, just get the average salary and get the 40% of that in a year for you to have value ani kung maglisod og estimate. Kay, well, if you don't have that kind of kanang standard approach into getting this one, then magpataka na lang ka, di ba? Magpataka na lang ka usay cost ana or usay worth ana na type of certain job productivity in dollars or peso perhaps. And then kaning Z, mo ni siya ang mean sa test score, di ba? Remember, we have a test score, we have a test, we have a score on the test. So, unsa may mean Z score ana sa tanang applicants na ni-take ana. So, what we multiply all these values and then we subtract it with the cost per test per applicant. And so, SDY is often estimated as the 40% of mean salary for the job. So then, makakuha na dayon ta sa kumpila ang utility gain in sa book no dollars, but in our case, no, in peso. Now, the thing with this utility estimates is that it is an estimate and oftentimes is very idealistic. Dili siya mo reflect kung unsay conditions sa real world, kung unsay na experience sa real world. For example, when we're talking about the applicant pool, right? The utility formula would expect na the applicant pool will not contain any attrition, meaning to say, tanang mga hire kay mudawat sa posisyon. That's not true. Kay kanang, well, if you have a top performer, say for example, this is your scatter plot, right? And then you have this one here, chances are they're also applying to better companies and they're highly coveted. So not all the time na mudawat sila sa job. And that affects your utility estimate. Nga naman, kung di sila mudawat sa imuhang job, even if naakay high kanang hit rate meaning sakto imuhang test ba, so dili ka sakto prediction imuhang test. So even if nakay high hit rate, kung dili dawaton sa top performer imuhang job offer, murag ma-render na useless gyapon, di ba? Kasi sayang kag oras interview niya, pa-answer niya test niya, dili siya mo dawat. So it's still one of the cost. Another thing to consider is in certain economic conditions, and in some jobs as well, malisod ka pangita sa applicant pool, especially for katong mga jobs na kailangan nyo siya skills na grabe, di ba na? Kailangan siya high skills, highly technical skills. For example, programmers, very lisod kini pangitaon ang software developers, mga lawyers na ganahan lawyers na full-time. Gamay ra kaayo ang lawyers na ganahan mag full-time. Usually, retainers ra na ilahang ganahan na maglisod mig pangita to sa una. Nag-hire mig lawyer, wala jud naabtan na lag 4 months, pag yun na-hire. Naabtan na lag 1 year, pag yun na-hire. No? So, we have these things to consider. So, mana siyang, the scholars, in particular, si Murphy sa iyahang 1986 study, na siya i-reduce na lang ninyo ang inyong estimate through 80% na lang to make it realistic. So, i-times na mo ng 0.80 ang imuhang utility gain to make it realistic na even if that is what the math says, we have these realistic or practical considerations to consider. Okay, so I mentioned already job complexity as well, diba? So did I? Murag wala pa. So also sa formula, diba na dito'y productivity or standard deviations of performance in terms of dollar or money or peso. Now, dili man na ang kani siya na formula gi-apply na siya sa tanang job, pero that's not the case kay lahi ba yan na og complexity ang job. Nay uban na example sa assembly lines, right? Kanang mga factory workers. In a certain day na ang ilahang measure sa output is how many products they can make na dili na walay issue, no walay kanang factory defects. So that's easily to measure. How about those people na developers, right? So ilang task is to create a program. Or how about the creatives? Now, their task is to create videos, create marketing materials. How do we measure that one? So, again, it's one of the things that make the estimates not in particular, not a good kuan ba kay. It's too idealistic and it does not account for these conditions. And lastly is the base rate. We've touched on the base rate already in our previous lectures. And to just give you a refresher, suppose there is like this population, right? Of these numbers are thrown around. This is not the exact numbers. I'm just spewing anything I could to drive the point across to make it simpler. So example, we have 1 million Filipinos, right? And a few of it are geniuses. If your sample is, right, 1,000, even if your test validity is 80%, that's pretty high, right? Or 88%. Meaning, igana siya iyang accuracy level in terms of detecting the geniuses, dako gihapon mo makuha og mga participants na genius, ay dili genius, pero i-consider sa test na genius because the base rate is low. So, kung naglibog o kung paspas ra kaayo, maninindo sa video, no, pwede ra gyud i-backtrack o ihinay o kuan, time 0.05 ang kapaspason. Okay? Again, even if taas kay kag specificity rate or sensitivity rate, kung imong base rate kay gamay, naagya po kay dakong chance na magka false negative o false positive. Okay? Hope that's clear. So I have here a situation. This is just a revised one sa kung ano sa close up. And we will discuss it. It's very useful man. So you can apply this in terms sa situational ba like mahitabo gyud siya sa real life. Though ang calculation in my experience sa HR walay calculation na nga ni nahitabo kay maybe this is for kanang major companies bitaw na bitaw very like a single introduction of a certain tool would need more decision or would need more deliberation in terms of decision because it could potentially kanang ni harm the company through profit loss if dili nila matarong og timbang, right? Sample ang company is kanang well known and in a certain year or month daghan kay silang applicants. And kanina applicant vital sila sa company and they want to introduce a certain test to really select the best applicants. And because ang gravity ana kung wrong ilang pag-introduce as tool in the hiring process is dako kayo na loss kung dili tarong og decide or di tarong og make og decision. That's why we have this one. Mo na nata utility analysis. And this is one of the things na it's done in real world. So, Jerica Herrera is an HR personnel considering using a driving road exam to hire 60 drivers for Cebu State University. The exam costs 1,000 to conduct per applicant. Through validating their scores against their supervisor rating, Ms. Herrera is presented with the following dilemma. Would she decide, is it better to decide na to cut cost na lang and not implement the DRE since it's 1,000 good per applicant? Imagine imong cost ana if you have like about 60,000 or 600 applicants, right? And next is use the DRE or use the exam, pero in this condition, you set the cut score low and the selection ratio high. This is for you na wala kay kanang na zero imuhang false positive, no? So next is kaning third option is to limit the false negative. So to limit the false negative, you set the cut score high, which is 80, and the selection ratio that follows is also 10%. And then the last is moderate siya, di ba? 48, and then moderate po ang selection ratio. Before proceeding to the graphs, let me tell you a quick way to remember the relationship sa cut score o sa selection ratio. You can also find this in our material, but I'm introducing this here for those who are too lazy to check the material, and for those that don't have the copy po, no? So when the selection ratio is down, SR is down, that means there are less applicants around. Okay? So, that only means na kay gamay man ang selection ratio as to letter C, option C, ang atong cut score is high. Okay? Cut score is high. So, if our cut score is high, our selection ratio is down. So, meaning gamay ratag interviewon, gamay ratag kanang ipasulod sa job. Next is, if our selection ratio is high, that means our cut score is low. So you can see it here, di ba? Very lenient. 18 ang cut score. So taas ang selection ratio. Unsay meaning ani kung taas ang selection ratio? Meaning, daghan ang employees na imuhang i-cater, imong i-dawat sa job. So selection ratio is high, employees say hi. Okay? Cut score is low, more employees to know. Say, mo nila relationship sa duha. Murag inverted. Okay? Selection ratio is down, less applicants around. Wala kayo kay ko ipasulod sa job. And if your selection ratio is down, your cut score is high, which means that you bid applicants goodbye. Ganong bid applicants goodbye man? Kay tungod ka taas imong cut score na kay daghang ma-dismiss. Kay wala sila na-appeal sa imuhang standard. So ato ni siyang tagsa-tagsaon starting first with option A. So option A is the dilemma wherein dili na magamit og kanang exam. Okay? So mag-cost cut by not using an exam. I'm trying to get the marker to be seen. Okay, anyway, we have the marker now. So, if we do not use the DRE, technically, everybody that applies, tanang driver na mo apply, which is 60 in this case, madawat siya. Niya mo undergo sila 3 months probationary and ari na sila hagpaton once ang supervisor mo rate nila as unqualified. Muna siya, originally, di ba? Ang walay, ang maning original process sa hiring before the introduction of DRE. Now, what happens? With a base rate of 0.50, meaning 50%, you also get a 50% miss rate. Okay? M na siya ha. So so a 50% miss rate, imagine na 30 sa imuhang gi-hire within 3 months magsigi og kasayop. So what's the cause ani? What's the cause ani, 'di ba? Lawsuits, loss of trust, especially if driver ka nya imuhang mga ipang drive is mga officials, mga delegates, mga students. Loss of life possibly because reckless ang driver, 'di ba? So daghan kaayo siya cause na dili siya from the get-go, dili siya noticeable, sige, naka-save uroy ka, pero grabe sa pod kag bawi sa losses nimo in terms sa lawsuits na imong bayaran, sa lawyers na imong bayaran, sa mga kinabuhi na imong na ano no, na agrabyado because you kanang kuan, you kami kog bird. Anyway, kanang you, ang chata gani, you decided to cost cut and use the DRE. So butang ta lang si Miss Herrera na siya, sige, we will use the DRE kay para mas nindot taog ka ng hit rate sa ato ang ma-hire na mga drivers. So how do we use the DRE then? Do we use the top approach wherein the top 20 ang madawat murag kuan ba America's Next Top Model, di ba maingan na? So usay may tabo if ang top 20 ray madawat. Looks ideal, di ba? Si kani. Oh, madawat ni siya. Count tag 20 ha. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Base man siya sa FRT score. So, towards the right side ang unang dawaton. So, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Kani oh? 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Nya kaning tulo parehang mag-score. So, unsay basis nimo 19, 20. So, kani sila even if like they are qualified through the criterion of the supervisor's rating, dili sila madawat kay wa man sila na-appeal sa top 20. And even if like this one, na pareha siyang score sa the other three, wa po siya nadawat. Kay naguna lang ang the rest niya, di ba? So it's very discriminatory na approach if ang top 20 ang paggamit sa DRE. So, yan na si Ms. Herrera, are there any other ways na we can use the DRE? So, naa Ms. Herrera, there is an option B for us. Okay? So, ana si ang utility analysis command prompt something. Unsa man ni? You set the cut score very low. This is to 18. And then the selection ratio then would be very high. So its cut score is low. Kay gambay man kay siya, lenient kay siya. Then daghan kayo kag dawaton na applicants. Taas kay kag selection ratio. So say may tabuan ni. Ang imo rang i-reject ang katong pinaka lowest of the low, which is 3 people. What will happen? You indeed have a 0 false negative. So sa ganang false negative, mga gipang reject, but really has the ability. Look at quadrant D. Diba 0 siya? Even if you raise to here, like 0.20 kapin, 0.25 or something, your rate for FN would still be 0. But what's nani for setting the cut score very low? You accept people that are not qualified. Dako gihapon ka o false positive. Okay? So, is this ideal in this setup? Still no. Kaya dako-dako biyag siya. Although naakay, imagine ang given is 18 jud ay no, so not this one. Mabala na siya din siya may race. So kanino dako kang false positive. That's still not ideal. Okay, even if your FN is 0, okay, in terms sa dilemma ba, because of the applicant pool, which is drivers, it's not really necessary na you have a 0 false negative. Okay? So, mo na siya timbangon nimo which is which, lesser or lower false negative, or do we want lower false positive? So with that being said, for test, for example, na mga drivers, i-test out sila kung naa ba sila tendency to be a kanang, ano siya tawag ni? Pedophilia ba? So, kuan sila mag-sexually harass sila mga bata, di ba niya? School drivers ba yan? Bus drivers ba sila mga bata? So, of course, you wouldn't want to have kanang kuan. You wouldn't want to have a false negative ana, di ba? You indicate na the driver is healthy person, that wala siya tendencies to pedophilia, where in fact he has. So that rather ingani you would want na your FN 0, but that's not the case here man, kay you're talking about the ability sa driver. So an FN is not that important. Let's look at option C then. Unsa ning option C? It's where we set the cut score very high and the SR very low. So meaning stringent kaayo siya cut score. Standard no 80. So because our cut score is very high and we have very stringent standards, our selection ratio is low. Gamay ratag dawaton na applicant sa job. So in this case, only these people here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, ang madawat, no? Roughly just 10%. So what happens? O sa implication ani niya? So we do have 0, very low false positive, Di ba? Kabantay mo na kung kani ang cut score in this quadrant B, wala man siya any dots. So wala kay madawat na kanang driver na walay skill, ay wala kay madawat na driver na kanang walay skill no or unqualified. Wala man ni siya diri. So you technically have zero false positive pero daghan sa kay kag ma-reject na naa ditoy kakayanan. So unsay application ani? Because every round of testing you just get 10 applicants, 6 to 10 applicants. Magsikag balik-balik ana. Imagine ang cost ana. Imagine ang cost sa kanang sa pag-attract og applicant pool, sa pag-attract og technical drivers, right? Example, bus. Not everyone knows how to drive bus. So it will be costly pod gihapon. Kay gagmay ra man kag dawaton where in fact daghan pa dito pwede kanang qualified ba or qualified daghan pa tong qualified sa job. So this one still is not ideal. Kay again, although zero imuhang false positive, grabe man sa kay imuhang false negative, taas kay imuhang false negative, di ba? So, unsa di ay ang next option? Let's go over option D. What if we just set the cut score to mid? So, at, saan siya, 45, 48? Di ba? At around those, and our SR2 is also mid, di ba? Because our con is mid, our cut score is mid, then also our SR is mid, M. So, if this is the case, gamay ra kayo ato ang false positive. And gamay ra pud kaayo ato ang false negative. Okay? So, we conclude, because of this ratio, imagine na, imuhang maneglect na naay ability is just around, out of the kanang 30, you just reject around 4 or 5 kanang applicants. And out of the 30 qualified, you accept those 4 or 5 people pod na walay skill and qualified. So, looking at it, if imong i-eyeball ang kakuan niya ba, ang kadako sa miss rate, this one is the ideal one. Kay gamay siyang error both on the FN and the FP. Could be po, di ba, na kaning people here has a chance to improve through training programs. Mo na siyang ang option D ang ideal. Set the cut score to mid, SR to mid. This is not always the case. Okay? As mentioned, if your test is kanang example to detect katong mga kanang those who has tendencies to sexually harass or kanang may ganang type, no, you would want higher or lower na mga false negative. So it really just depends on your hiring needs, on the position and the complexity of the position. So for this case, sa dilemma ni Ms. Herrera, option D is the most ideal. So let's move on. Hapit na tamahong man class. Gamay na lang, Jude. So let's move on. Let's go to the kanang the different methods in or the different types of cut scores pa di ay. Okay, so unlike sa atong previous chapters no katong validity and reliability, mo dito pinaka-hardcore na lisod siya sabton kani sayo na ni siya tunlon. Gamay lang computation katurang BCG no na formula, which is just really multiplying some variables for the benefits and then you subtract it and then multiplying the cost of the test per applicant, di ba? So sayo na gyud ni siyang utility. All it takes is patience, di ba? Tanan butang makatunan ra gyud na siya. Naalang gyud untay patience towards the self and towards the material that you're reading. Anyway, usa ni mga cut scores? We have the relative or the norm reference. Since this is already a familiar word, you know that a norm reference would depend on the scores of the test takers, diba? So, the same po ng norm reference criterion. Parehara na silang meaning. So, kung unsay tail, kung ano ni, norm reference, cut score, relative cut score then, the cut score is set based on the performance of a group rather than the relationship to a criterion. So say for example, in introduction to psychology, I would say the top 5% will earn on this exam, the top 5% will earn a perfect grade, 100 over 100 on your midterms exam. The next top 10 after the first few would earn a grade of 85 over 100. So, because it is pagset sa cut score is relative to the scores of the test takers, this is the relative or norm reference cut score. Basta na siyang absolute. It's based on the minimum level of proficiency required. So for example, for you to go to the next level, di ba, na maka-enroll pa ka, you need to get 2.5 lowest na grade in your kanang subjects. If dili ka 2.5, dili nakaka-enroll, di ba, sa mga major courses and major subjects. So, Mo na siya. Now, kung 2.5 kasi mo mga major subjects sa psych niya, 1.0 kasi imuhang mga minor, dili gyapon ka ka-enroll, di ba? So, that is an example of a fixed cut score. So, that is very sabottable. So, we'll move on to the next, which is we have the multiple hurdles and we have the compensatory model. These are very easy to understand. When we say multiple hurdles, there's a stage and per stage, dapat ma-accomplish ni mo siya. Naka-set minimum na trait na dapat ma-accomplish before ka mo move on to the next one. So for example, when you were applying to be a student here sa CTU, nag-regret ba mo? Okay, so for example, when you're applying, first you need to submit your your grade 12 grades. And as one of the screeners, I would look at a grade not less than kanang dili daghan og line of 8. Usually kung na line of 8 magduduha kog accept ana. No, usually depende po na sa judgment sa screener. Right? So example, ma-accept mo, then nakapass ka sa first hurdle. Next is you would then undergo an entrance exam, and if you pass the entrance exam, you would proceed to the interview, and once you've passed the interview, you then are selected to be one of the students ni CTU. So this multiple hurdles. How about the compensatory model? You can see this one in the kanang beauty pageants bitaw, di ba na weight, sa to ganay? Differential weightings in terms of, for example, talent portion is kanang 30%, Q&A is blah, 20%, and evening gown is, di ba? And then this 30%, these are what you call the weights, right? So even if you scored low in the talent portion, if you scored high in both the evening gown and the question and answer, napay chance mabitad ni siya. That is compensatory model. So where high scores in one area balance out low scores in another. So those are the two kanang methods. I rather kanang mga kanang model. Now I have your question. So think about the graduate school admissions. Should programs use multiple hurdles or should they use compensatory model? Is it this one or this one? Nga naman, usa may pros and cons sa each if you use this for graduate school placement. I want you to form your own thoughts on this, so I won't comment. And pause the video, write down your answers, or maybe verbalize lang, talk to yourself. Then once you're done, let's move on to the next and the last topic. Hapit na gyud, gamay na na jud. Okay, so we have methods for setting cut scores. Dito methods ang before now, so those are kanang, what do you call this one? Mga types of cut scores. Anyway, we have the Angoff method, which is the widely used. Ayun ka siya, simple to kanang to conduct. And then we have the known groups method, which is very data driven. It has a statistics involved. Napo ni siya statistics, pero simple ra ang statistics ani. And then the IRT based methods. Now, unsa ni siyang Angoff method? It's interscorer basically, but you use it not for reliability. In a sense, it mo affect ang reliability coefficient for the interscorer ani niya. But what happens is, for example, there's 10 judges and per item mo na silang kanina item mo ni siya ang pinaka minimal score that the person can get that has the ability of that. For example, mathematics. Okay, so for this item it's 60 and etc. And paon na siya ang mean ani niya. For example, sa tanang item sa test 10 ra siya kabuok, kwaon dayon ni siya, di ba, per item kwaon ang kwaon ang kanang mean sa judges. Tapos kwaon na siya the average of all the scores sa tanang judges ana niya. So we have a cut score of 42. Ano siya kasayon? The thing with this one is bati siya because again, mag-base man siya good sa judge. Of course, subjective na po siya, prone to bias. So, if you have low inter-rater reliability, you cannot really insist that your cut score is valid. Let's move on to this one, the known groups method and the IRT-based method, which contains a bit of kanang statistics ani, but don't worry about it. Wala dira ta mag-compute ani, just important for you to understand ani nilang known groups method. So ni siyang known groups method panalitan, there is a group of people na ni pass and there is a group of people na ni fail a certain subject. Butang talag math, no? Kay most of us don't like math. So, ang buhaton ani is ang mo make sa test para mo validate na siya is magkuha sila data for a certain period and then ilang i-divide ang group. Katong usually mo pass sa mathematics or mga bright og math and katong ni fail sa mathematics. And then if you look at the graph there in our material, the ni merge na scores in the middle. And so, ang kaning merging of scores, they would set that as a cut score. So kani panalitan, kaning end here going to the center, diba kay two contrasting biya. So we have a group na usually score high on these tests, score high on these tests, and we have a group here that score low on these tests. Kung asa sila mag-abot sa tunga, mao na siya ang i-denote as a cut score. That is the known groups method. Unsay bati-an niya? Choosing where to put the person, either to pass or to fail, could be difficult for some constructs. For example, in the given example sa book was depression, right? How about for attractiveness? No, there are certain psychological constructs na wala may kuan. Wala bitaw siya kanang set na makaingon jud kag objective na kanang okay, cut off na kani pass ka, kani bati kag naong so diri ka niya, kani gwapa ka so diri ka, di ba? So na may nga na instances. So ang kana pa lang pag-categorize asa nimo ibutang siya na group is labad na noon sa ulo. It's a new was unsa na idiom, like a whole new world or like a can of worms on its own, right? If you open it. Anyway, ang IRT based method is kanang kuan na siya kanang i-arrange niya ang item by difficulty level. Okay, so kanang naay pinaka known na IRT method, which is the bookmark method. Literally, you're gonna place a bookmark sa item. So there is a book containing all the items of the exam, and then the judge would then place a bookmark kung asa tingin niya ang middle ground ba na makaingon ka na kani siya dili ni competent ya, kani siya competent ni siya sa kanina kanang construct. Reading ability, mathematics ability, emotional sensitivity, you name it, di ba? So again, magdepende gihapon siya sa judge. So ang one of the things na kanang drawback jud with regards to this one na subjective siya na naa siya input sa kanang judge or expert is ang ang credibility sa experts, because what if ang imuhang mga nakuha na mga experts is kuwang og training ani na method or doesn't even know or just appears to be an expert but doesn't really know what they're talking about, diba? So those are the kinds of things na you should consider with regards to these two types of kanang methods. The other methods are already there sa ato ang source material. I'm not going to discuss, it's not that important anyway. So we're finally done. Finally. So for our key takeaways, utility goes beyond reliability and validity to assess the practical value and cost effectiveness of testing. We've already discussed this one extensively. There are three key factors: psychometric soundness, which includes reliability and validity, the cost, both economic and non-economic, and of course the benefits also has economic and non-economic benefits. Utility analysis methods are ranged from expectancy tables to sophisticated formulas like the BCG. I don't think it's that sophisticated because it's easy to calculate, but anyway, for me, ang kani siya mas lisod. But anyway, to each their own. And also, another key takeaways is that cut scores can be relative or norm reference and also fixed. And we also have multiple hurdles and compensatory models of cut scores. And setting cut scores requires careful methodology. The Angoff method, the known groups method, and the IRT methods, all of them have strengths and limitations. And of course, as a food for thought and para na ko'y mabilin, a psychometrically sound test is worth paying for when potential benefits are high or potential costs of not using it are high. Utility decisions require prudence, vision, and common sense, not just formula. Hope this clear. Thank you, class, for listening. See you in the next lecture. And dili na ko makaingog have fun learning kay murag wala na gid mo na lingaw. Okay? So, basta, kayod lang. Bye!